Hi, we're in the field today. Recently, people have contacted me asking me to do a presentation on wilderness survival, so today will be my top 5 tips for wilderness survival. And it comes with a long list of disclaimers, and no, I won't talk this fast throughout the entirety of the presentation. First on the list is, it's going to be a top 5 list because I really only know 5 things about the subject. Secondly, fair warning, just about all I'm going to do today is talk, and you're going to have to put up with my Shatner-esque pauses and my very annoying habit of transposing words and syllables. 3, when I talk, I'm going to be talking about my conclusions and my opinions. My opinions are based on my education, my training, my experiences. Different people have different experiences, so they have different opinions, and I make no claim that mine has its origin in the mind of greatness. 4, even though I might say things like, you should do this and always remember that, I am not trying to give you any advice, with one exception. When I say keep your ego in check, that is advice. Other than that, I'm really only explaining what I do and why. Nothing I say today should be inferred as any kind of tutorial or recommendation. And 5, I'm going to start out today by telling a long, boring, tedious anecdote. In fact, I'm going to talk for a long time before we ever get to the top 5 list. This anecdote is not worth telling, except that it does help illustrate some of the points I want to make on the top 5 list. So you're going to have to sit through the long version of it. Unless you'd like to skip the tedious anecdote, then I invite you to fast forward to the part where you see me standing next to a sign that reads top 5. Okay, for those who are still here, let me explain the format of today's presentation. First, I'm going to tell the anecdote, then I will have a comparatively very short discussion on my definition of wilderness survival, and then we'll get to the top 5 list. In telling this story, it comes with 4 things that you must keep in mind. And yes, I'm aware that I talk about tedium, and it becomes very tedious when the list of disclaimers is longer than the story. But I've been called upon to tell this story a few times, and I've discovered that this list of 4 things you must keep in mind is absolutely necessary to explain. The first one being that when I say it's a tedious, anticlimactic anecdote, I'm not trying to be modest, it really is. It's a story about events that are about as close to nothing as they could be while still being something. And I only tell it because it really does help illustrate some points I want to make later on. The second thing is that I'm going to tell this in an AAR format. Now, different AARs will have different formats, but today's format will be the explanation of the events as they occurred and just what happened without a lot of editorializing about the whys and hows. Then once I explain the events, then there will be a discussion on what went right, what went wrong, what to sustain, what to change, what to improve, and what we can learn from all of that. So I'm going to ask you to resist the temptation of making a lot of coulda, shoulda statements until I get to the explanation and evaluation portion of it. The third thing is, even though this anecdote is long and tedious, I really am giving you a condensed version of it. In the interest of brevity and relevance, there's a lot of things I leave out. And when I'm called upon to tell this in front of a live audience, it is very common that someone will interrupt me and say some version of coulda, woulda, shoulda, and tell me what I should have done. And when people are doing that, they are almost always speaking from a position of ignorance, because this is a condensed version. A really good example is, there's a faction of our society that has a fascination with shooting their guns in the air. And not just in this case, but in many things I discuss, there's always somebody that wants to tell me some coulda, shoulda version of, I should have shot my gun up in the air, and shot some kind of warning shot or signal shots. Okay. You think I'm long-winded now. It would take me 15 minutes to explain in any kind of adequate way why, in this particular case, shooting any kind of shots was not an option. But because it would take so long to explain, I'm going to ask you to just take it on a little bit of faith and let it suffice to say, shooting my gun up in the air was not an option. And that leads to 4, which is, please remember that what I'm about to talk about took place a long time ago. It was not in a galaxy far, far away. It was right here on Earth. But these events took place a long time ago. And when I discuss this, there's always people that want to give me chronocentric advice, and they'll make some version of coulda, woulda, shoulda. that wasn't an option at the time. The best example being that someone tells me that I should have used the GPS feature on my phone. Okay, this took place at a time when cellular phones did not have internet access, and they didn't typically have a flashlight as part of your phone or a GPS feature. In fact, this would have been at a time when, although cellular phones existed, really very few people were carrying them. So using the GPS feature on my phone wasn't an option. Okay, all of that in place, let's get started. First, let me set the stage for where and when this happened. It happened in the area we're in right now, and you can see a lot of very steep hills and canyons. We have logging roads that run along the sides of the hill. And it occurred in late December, so the temperature was in the mid to upper 30s, and although on that particular day there'd only been a light misting of rain off and on all day, in the weeks prior to this there had been a great deal of rain almost every day, and everything in this environment was wet. Also at that time, this area had been clear-cut about 25 years before this happened, so the replanted trees had become fairly tall, but there was still a lot of underbrush in the area. So with that in place, I want to try to give you a visual, to the best I can, of what I was wearing and what equipment I had with me that day. Let's take a look. On that day I was wearing a set of BDUs, not this pattern, but basically the same garment. And I was wearing a Jones cap very similar to this one. No, the pattern doesn't match, but I'm far more concerned about the practicality of the headwear than the fashion of it. And I was wearing a set of jungle boots identical to these. Yes, I know, but we're still in the mode of explaining what happened. I was also wearing a coat, and I don't have one analogous to it to show you today, but it was not a military field jacket. It was just your typical cotton poly blend shell Dacron Holofill 2 insulation, and its insulating power was very good. Its water resistant properties virtually non-existent. I was also wearing thin cotton gloves similar to these. And when the temperature's in the mid-30s, thin cotton gloves like this are perfectly sufficient until they get wet. Now for equipment, I was wearing an LBV, not this one, but a more basic version, but I still had a knife, holstered pistol, ammo pouch, canteen, and so on. And I was carrying a Ruger 1022 rifle, very similar to this one. So although what I'm showing you is not perfectly analogous, it is a pretty good visualization that'll give you a good idea of what I was wearing and the equipment I had with me that day. And now we're to the part where I finally tell the boring story. And we're filming it right here. Even though this is not exactly where it happened, this terrain approximates it very well. And the story goes like this. I'm driving on a paved road. I leave the paved road and drive on a one-lane dirt and gravel logging road. I come to a part where several logging roads intersect, and from this intersection they go out in various directions to various distances where they all dead end. And there's one that goes less than half a mile this way and one that goes over a mile that way. I leave the vehicle and I start walking on one of these roads. And I come to a point where the road forks in a way that looks a lot like what you're seeing here. And this is the part where I have to say, at the time, I was very familiar with the area. I knew that the upper road went up about 300 meters and dead-ended into a log landing, kind of like a cul-de-sac. The other one continued on fairly straight for at least a mile and a half. I never had actually walked to the end of that road, but I knew it was at least a mile and a half. So I go to the upper road, go to the end of it, and I'm up there for a while. And just about sunset, I decide that it's time to head home. But instead of coming back down the road, what I'm going to do is go downhill, cross-country, through the bushes, hit the lower road, take a left, and head back to the vehicle. Even though I'm going to be doing this in the dark, it will be easy to navigate because it's a short distance. It's only about 300 meters. And because the longer road goes so much farther than the shorter road, that even if I veer off course quite a bit, I can't get off course enough to miss the longer road. The only way I could do that would be if I headed 180 degrees in the wrong direction and started going back uphill. I think I'd notice if I was going uphill instead of downhill. So just after sunset, I leave the log landing, head into the bushes. It's important to point out that at that moment I did not look at my watch, but I walked for what I would estimate was 10 minutes. In that 10-minute time, I became drenched. Imagine that in this environment. There was so much water on the bushes, so much water on the low-hanging fir boughs that I was drenched. There was a point during this 10-minute foot movement that I had stopped for just a moment to look around a little bit, and I could feel water running. I was standing in a stream that was about 6 inches deep and 1.5 feet wide, and I was so wet I hadn't even noticed the wetness of the stream. I'd only noticed the movement of the water. So I got out of the stream and kept walking, but at the end of about 10 minutes, I look around and I say, I should be there any minute. And here's where I did look at my watch. Then I kept going for 15 more minutes. Okay, I should have been there long before now. But I reasoned that maybe these two roads are farther apart than I thought. Maybe I'm going through the bushes, traveling farther to get a short distance than I thought I had been. Maybe I'm going a lot slower than I thought. I'll keep going. I went for another 15 minutes. Okay, obviously if I were going to hit the lower road, I'd have hit it by now. Obviously I've made some mistake in navigation. And the way I worded it to myself was, obviously I've done something wrong. But what? And I stewed over that for a while, and I couldn't come up with any answer. Obviously I'm going the wrong direction. But what direction am I going? I didn't have a compass with me. Yes, I know, but we're still in mode of discussing what happened. We'll discuss that in depth in the analysis portion. I also can't navigate by any celestial bodies because of the thick cloud cover. And that thing about moss growing on the north side of a tree, there is some validity to that, but it doesn't really apply in this area. So what I'm stuck with is, I've made some mistake in navigation. I have no idea what that mistake is. And in any practical sense, I don't know where I am. I do know that the paved road on which I started runs almost perfectly north and south and goes for many miles. And I know I'm on the east side of it. If I head directly west, I might have to go over quite a few hills to get there, but I'll get to that paved road to get back to where I need to be. But I'm at a point where I have no means of navigation. The only option I have left that I can think of is that I know that in some of the very highest peaks in this area, if I get up on top of those, I can see the lights of cities in the distance. I can see lights of a small city about 15 miles over here, a bigger city about 20 miles over there, and so maybe I can get some bearing from that. But now it's well after ENT. Where is a hill? Well, I can see what I think is kind of a hill. So I walked to the top of this hill, and of course what I saw from the top of the hill was nothing. Okay, this is where I'm going to spend the night. Right there at the top of the hill, there's a lot of trees, but there was 3 fairly good-sized fir trees in an almost perfect equilateral triangle, about 7 feet apart, and their interlocking branches made a really good canopy to keep the rain off. Under the trees, the ground was only damp, not absolutely drenched like it was everywhere else. So now, it's after ENT, the temperature has gone from the mid-30s to the low 30s, I am drenched. This is going to turn into a hypothermia situation really quick. I got to get my act together. Well, in this environment, about the best place to find any kind of dry firewood are the dead, dry branches on the lower parts of fir trees. And I was able to pick off some little twigs, get my fire starters out, get this together, and build a little fire. But it provided enough light that I could see around and find bigger wood. I didn't have a flashlight with me, yes I know, but the little fire gave me just enough light that I could find some stuff. And as I found more stuff, I got the fire going bigger. I couldn't really chop any big branches, but I did have a knife that allowed me to chop some of the smaller ones, so I got a fairly good fire going under the conditions. This allowed me to dry off quite a bit. I also had some extra socks with me. Now, my socks were in my cargo pocket, so they were wet too, but they were only damp, not wring-out wet like the socks on my feet. And my extra socks were thick, heavy wool socks, so when I traded socks, that was a big step in the right direction. I also had a full canteen and a 6-pack of Pop-Tarts, so I had some food and water. I'm not doing too bad. Not only that, I had a big plastic lawn and leaf garbage bag, which I was able to put on the ground, sit down on that so I'm not sitting on the wet ground. So once I got my fire going pretty well, I was able to dry out fairly well, and I end up building up the fire, laying down on the ground next to it, going to sleep. Then, of course, over the course of about 30 or 40 minutes, the fire burns down. I wake up shivering, get some more stuff put on there, get it going, get the fire built back up, warm up. And I did this same cycle several times through the night. Build up the fire, sleep for a while, the fire burns down, I wake up, rebuild the fire. Finally, at BNT, there's enough light that I can look around and go a little farther and get more and bigger wood. And I got the fire built up fairly well. That allowed me to get dried off really well and warmed up. And so right about sunrise, I'm in good shape. And with the sun rising in the southeast, now I have some ability to tell what direction I'm going, and so I can head west and get back to the road. Now here's the part where I have to discuss the concept of people looking for me. Before I'd left home, I had told people exactly where I was going and when I would be back. So people noticed when I didn't come back on time. But does that mean they came looking for me? I had no idea if anybody was going to look for me. So I was not operating in the mode of people are looking for me. I was operating in the mode of now I know what direction I need to go, I'm going to get going. So I did. Well, it turned out that yes, people were looking for me. People had come into the area the night before and just done a cursory search, decided that they couldn't find me, and so decided that they would come back the next morning and do a real search. So in the morning, when I started moving, they were out in the area looking for me. I hadn't walked 2 minutes before I saw a squirrel. I shot it, stuck it in my pocket. I might need to eat that later. That shot alerted those people to at least some semblance of my location, got them headed in the right direction. I didn't walk 2 or 3 more minutes before I came across a logging road. Not the road I was looking for, but I knew this road would lead somewhere, so I start walking on this road, and I hadn't been on the road 3 minutes before somebody drove up and they found me. Now, I want to make this part very clear. I greatly appreciate people coming out and looking for me. It took a lot of effort. Thank you. Also, even though by the time they found me I'd solved my own problem, they did save me an 8-mile foot movement back to where my vehicle was. Again, thank you. But by the time they had found me, I'd really solved my own problem. Nobody rescued me. You gotta keep your ego in check, and that's going to come up later as we go. Another part of that same thing is, later that day, as I'm talking to a couple of people that were looking for me, one of the people that had been out the night before was discussing how they'd found some footprints in the mud on the road, and they presumed those footprints were mine. If they were or not, I really don't know. But they followed these footprints for a short distance and then lost the trail. But with those footprints, one of the people told me, quote, "We tracked you easy!" Close quote. Okay. At the time, I was too polite to say anything about it, but let me put the question to you. What's wrong with the statement, "We tracked you easy"? Exactly. If you had so easily tracked me, you would have found me. You didn't track anything. Nobody tracked me easy. Guys, you've got to keep your egos in check, and that's a very important part of what I'm talking about. So, all of that having been said, that's the story of what happened. Now let's get to the part where we discuss what went right, what went wrong, and what we can learn from it. Now we're to that part of the ARR where I discuss what went right, what went wrong, what to sustain, what to improve, what to eliminate. What can we learn from all of this? And I'm going to start with what went wrong. Many things did, but in the interest of brevity, I'm going to talk about what I consider to be the top 4. 1, the question, how did I miss the lower road? What went wrong there? Well, I have an answer, although it's not a particularly satisfactory one. A day or 2 after this happened, I came back into the area and attempted to answer the question, how did I miss the lower road? Well, it was easy to figure out how. This road that went on pretty well straight for 1.5 miles, no it didn't. It went on pretty well straight for about 300 meters, then curled around and went about another 100 or 200 meters and dead-ended. All I did was, from the upper road, walk past the end of the lower road. Which brings up the question, if it only went down there for about 300 meters, what made me think that it went 1.5 miles? And the answer is, at the time, I had no idea why I thought that. And now, many years later, when I look back at this, I still have no idea what made me think that road went on in a direction to a distance that it didn't go. The problem was I didn't know the area nearly as well as I thought. And that's point 2 of my 4 is I didn't know the area nearly as well as I thought. Now, it is not being boastful to say that I know the area very well. I do. But just not nearly as well as I thought I did. Which brings me back to the point, you gotta keep your ego in check. Now, the third thing is that there was a lot of gear that I should have had that I just didn't have. Like a compass. And we'll discuss a little bit about the why of that later. But I didn't have a compass with me. If I had, I could have solved my own problem that night. Other things I didn't have with me, like a flashlight. That wouldn't have helped me keep from getting lost. But once I did, it would have made everything else that happened a lot easier. Other things I didn't have were appropriate gear for the environment. Yes, I had a coat, but I should have had a raincoat. I'm wearing jungle boots, which are made for hot, wet environments. I should have been wearing some kind of waterproof boot, or even just leather boots with a good coat of polish or wax would have been highly water resistant. I was wearing those thin cotton gloves. How about some thick wool gloves? I just didn't have a lot of the right gear. And 4, even though I did have some pretty good equipment, I didn't utilize that equipment to its full potential, and in some cases didn't carry the things the way I should have carried them, or packaged them the way I should have. For example, my extra socks, I had them in my pockets. I should have just had them in Ziploc bags, so they'd be dry when I put them on. A good example is my big lawn and leaf garbage bag. Very good piece of equipment, lots of uses in the field, but instead of keeping it in my pocket until I'm getting ready to set up camp and putting it on the ground so I don't have to sit on the wet ground, before I ever left the road, I should have done that Boy Scout thing where you turn it upside down, cut a head hole in it, cut a couple of armholes in it, and put it over me as an impromptu field expedient raincoat. At least then, when I got to where I was going to spend the night, I would have only been drenched from the knees down. So I had some gear I needed, but didn't have what I needed, didn't carry it correctly, and in some cases didn't use it correctly. Now, what went right? That's probably a shorter list, but there are a few things on the what went right list. First, even though by the time people found me I'd solved my own problem, I'm going to say that telling people exactly where I was going and when I would be back was a right thing to do. The second thing that I did right was that I carried some pretty good equipment. Not as good as it should have been, but still some pretty good stuff. I had a full canteen, I had some Pop-Tarts, I had matches and fire starters. I had matches in a waterproof match container, and in addition to that, a box of waterproof matches. I had a lot of good equipment with me. And in addition to that, I had trained with that equipment. In fact, about 6 weeks before this happened, I'd been out in the field and done a training exercise that was simulating a lost in the woods scenario. And on that training exercise, I discovered that a lot of the stuff that I thought was going to work out well for me wasn't. And I really upgraded a lot of my stuff. Not as much as I needed to, but still upgraded a lot of my stuff. If not for that training exercise, when I got into this situation, I might have been in real trouble. And 4, a thing that I really did right was I followed that hunter education class doctrine of the first thing you do when you're lost is admit to yourself that you're lost and then prepare to spend the night. Now, part of that is also prepare a signal for people that are looking for you. I didn't do that because I had no clue that anybody was going to look for me. But I admitted to myself that I was lost instead of wandering around aimlessly all night. And I prepared to spend the night, and I kept my wits about me. And that is something that I did right. So with all of that, when we look at that situation and the things I learned from it, and many things that have happened in the years since then, that becomes the basis of my top 5 tips for wilderness survival. And now, like an infomercial that takes forever to get to the point, before we get to my top 5 tips for wilderness survival, we have to have the discussion on my definition of wilderness survival. I'm sure there are many people that would have many different definitions, but today we're going to talk about my definition. My definition has 5 points. Please watch this segment in its entirety because there are some exceptions to these points and some things I need to explain. And the 5 points are: in the field, under adverse conditions, when you have to spend the night or multiple nights, when you did not intend to and you were not prepared to. Now let me break that down. First, when I say in the field, I don't mean a rest area on the side of the freeway. I don't mean a campground that has bathrooms and showers and a payphone, if you can still find a payphone. I mean in the field, although some campgrounds are remote enough they would count as in the field. Secondly, under adverse conditions. That could be extremes of cold or wet or dry or hot. In the story I told, it was December, the temperature was in the low 30s, everything was very wet. That's adverse conditions. If that exact same thing had happened to me in July, everything would have been for the most part dry, and the coldest it ever would have gotten at night would have been 50 degrees. Now, if you're trying to sleep on the ground in 50-degree weather when you don't have a sleeping bag or some kind of space blanket or even a coat to wear, that can be uncomfortably cold, but not what I would call adverse conditions. If I'd been there in July and I wanted to start a fire, with everything pretty much dry, starting a fire would have been very easy. A bigger concern would have been keeping the fire from getting out of control. So point 2 is under adverse conditions. Now point 3, spending the night or multiple nights. There are some exceptions to this, but for the most part, if you solve your problem in the same day the problem started, that's not really what I'd call a survival situation. A good example is I went deer hunting with somebody who got genuinely lost for about 5 minutes until he decided on a course of action, executed it, found his way back to the car, solved his problem. Not a survival situation. However, on the other side of that, I saw an educational film on survival, and they told the story of these 2 people who were four-wheeling in the desert. Very hot, temperature around 100, very dry, and their vehicle broke down in the middle of nowhere. These 2 people had a discussion. One wanted to stay with the vehicle until someone came by. The other one wanted to walk back to town because town was only a couple of miles away. Now, they did have some good equipment, such as a big cooler full of ice and cans of beer and a gallon jug of drinking water. Well, what happened was, one stayed with the vehicle, the other one walked back to town. He became a heat casualty and died before he made it to town, which turned out to be 10 miles away, not 2. Now, his situation became a crisis long before he spent the night. So there are some exceptions to the spend the night rule, but what I'm going to say is a good rule of thumb, or in this case a rule of ring finger, is when you have to spend the night or multiple nights. And point 4 is when you had not intended to. Now again, in the story I told, I had no intent of spending the night. If my intent were to spend the night, I would have brought a backpack, a sleeping bag, a tarp in which to wrap that sleeping bag, camp stove, fuel, food, another canteen, so forth. And it wouldn't have been a survival situation, it would have been a camping trip. Now, there's a hair you can split between not intending to spend the night and not prepared to. Some people will say I was prepared to because I did have food and water and fire starters and so forth. No, when I say prepared to spend the night, I mean prepared with things like tent, sleeping bag, ground pad, the list goes on. Let me give you an example. A while ago, a couple of the crew and I decided we would make a 6-mile foot movement to see this waterfall. 3 miles there and 3 miles back. Well worth the walk. It was very cool. But we also wanted to make it a workout. So we took backpacks loaded with a bunch of gear. In my backpack, I had a sleeping bag, a tarp in which to wrap that sleeping bag, camp stove, fuel, a generous 2-day supply of food. The list goes on. If we'd gotten into a situation because the road washed out or there was an injury or something like that where we had to spend the night out, we were prepared to do that. It would have just been an impromptu camping trip. So the 5 points are: in the field, under adverse conditions, when you have to spend the night or multiple nights, when you had no intent to and you weren't prepared to. Now, that having been said, at long last, let's get to my top 5 tips for wilderness survival. So finally, here we are at the top 5. And if you're one of those people who chose to fast forward, this is the part where you want to stop fast forwarding when I'm standing next to the sign that reads top 5. So, let's get to number 1. The best way to successfully get out of a survival situation is to not get into that situation to start with. So number 1 on the list is stay out of the situation. Okay, that sounds like rather simplistic advice. It sounds like someone telling you that you don't need health insurance, just don't get sick. But there are things you can do to minimize your chances of getting into a survival situation. The first one being, tell somebody where you're going and when you'll be back. Now that might not help you on day 1. You might still spend the night in the field when you didn't intend to, but it might be one night, not several. Other things you can do are carry a compass and a map and your GPS and your cellular phone. Do the appropriate reconnaissance. Make sure that if you're going into an area you're not familiar with, go with someone who's been there before. It also means keep your ego in check. Don't allow you to think that you know more about the area than you really do. Keep your ego in check. Don't allow yourself to think that you're capable of more than you really are. If you're planning a day hike to the lake and from the trailhead to the lake is 6 miles, that means 6 miles in and 6 miles back. That's 12 miles. When was the last time you really walked 12 miles? You don't want to find out that your daily limit is 6 miles when you're 6 miles from the trailhead. Don't bite off more than you can chew. And that brings me to point 2. Let's take a look. Point 2 on my list is know yourself and seek self-improvement. You may have heard that one before. If you're that guy who can't walk very far, well, get to the gym, get out and do some walking. Try to improve that about yourself. And if you can't, then at least know that about yourself. And that same concept can apply to so many things, not only in life, but in a survival situation. If you're one of those people who routinely tells someone that you're going to be there at 1400 and then you don't show up until 1800, or you don't show up at all, then when you're going into the field and you tell somebody exactly where you're going and when you'll be back, when you don't come back, they will just chalk that up to that's how you are and no one will come looking for you. If you're that kind of person, know that about yourself, change that about yourself. And this applies to so many aspects of survival situations. Now, I'm not going to talk specifically about fire starting and fire building. I talk about that at length in a different presentation, but I am going to use fire building as an example. I've mentioned before that I've been in the field with people who were unable to get a fire going with a butane lighter, kiln-dried lumber, a tomahawk to chop up that lumber, and a quart bottle of kerosene. If that's the kind of person you are, know that about yourself and try to change that. Try to learn how to build a fire. Watch videos on fire building. Get out in the field and practice fire building. Join the Boy Scouts. Do something to change that about yourself. And this concept of knowing yourself and seeking self-improvement can apply to just about every aspect of what we're talking about in the gear you carry, how you use that gear, what you're capable of, and many, many other things. Now, that brings me to point 3, which is carry gear commensurate with your knowledge and skill level. If you're one of those people who can't start a fire unless you've got a quart of gasoline and a road flare, change that about yourself if at all possible. But until you learn how to build a fire, then when you go into the field, carry a quart of gasoline and a road flare. You've got to pack commensurate with your abilities. And today's presentation is not about survival guns, but this is where it comes up a lot of times in talking about survival, is people carrying guns that aren't really commensurate with their skill, their ability, and not really practical for the situation. A good example is people want to pack light, so they'll go into a field with a gun like this, Smith & Wesson Model 638 Airweight 38 Special Revolver, and they'll tell you that this is their survival gun. What are you trying to survive? If you're trying to survive a mugging, this might be a really good gun to have. But in a field environment like this, it may not be your best choice. You've got to carry guns that are commensurate with your skill level and what you might have to do. Let's see if we can demonstrate that. Here's a rabbit target, and this is my Beretta M922, which is one of my favorite handguns to carry in the field. I've got it loaded with Remington Golden Bullet 22 long rifle, 36 grain hollow point, and I'll shoot this target from about 25 yards, and let's see how we do. I fired 10 shots and I got 9 hits, and yes, this one is very annoying. The point of this exercise is that if I'm in the field shooting at rabbits at a distance that I consider realistic for shooting at rabbits, with this firearm, I know that I'm going to be able to hit that rabbit most of the time. And that's something that you have to do, is make sure that when you're in the field with whatever firearm you're carrying, shooting at whatever you're shooting at, that you can hit it at a realistic distance. And you have to ask yourself the question, can you do that? If the answer is yes, great. If the answer is no, then you have to do some training, maybe change your ammunition, change your firearm, do something until the answer is yes. If you ask yourself the question, can you hit what you're shooting at a realistic distance with the firearm you carry, and you answer yourself that you don't know, you've got to get to the range and answer that question. So point 3 was, carry equipment commensurate with your level of knowledge and skill. Point 4 is going to sound like it contradicts that. Point 4 is, don't overpack. On many occasions, I've had people show me some kind of backpack that they describe as their survival pack, and it has all kinds of good equipment in it, and it weighs 40, 50, even 60 pounds. You are not going to carry that consistently in the field. Packs like that get left at home, or they get left in the vehicle, and your vehicle is going to survive just fine while you're 10 miles away needing some gear that you don't have. You have to pack light enough that you'll actually have your equipment with you. Now, when telling that anecdote, I talked about I did not have a flashlight on me. There was a reason for that. Because the technology of that time and my budget of that time, the flashlight I owned was a 99-cent 2 D-cell battery flashlight. And it was about this size. So when I went on backpacking trips, of course I had that flashlight in my pack. But for a day trip where I'm not wearing a pack, that's just too burdensome to have in my pockets. Now today, because I have a little bit bigger budget and we have much better technology, I almost always have a flashlight with me in the field. This one. Twist it and it comes on. Twist it again and it's on very bright. This flashlight has a rechargeable battery in it. You recharge it with a cell phone charger. This is the kind of thing I'll keep on me, and you've got to create a balance between having something like this on you and having something like this that you left at home. And you may have to pack a pack, unpack it, repack it, train several times, but you've got to carry your stuff in a convenient sense, like a backpack or some kind of fanny pack, and you have to have enough gear that you have enough to get the job done, but you have to have it small enough and light enough for consistent carry. And speaking of backpacks and fanny packs, let's get to point 5. Point 5 on my list is that once you've got all the gear together that you're going to carry, put it into something that's easy to carry and make sure you carry it. Whether that's a small backpack, a fanny pack, some kind of LBV, or just a jacket that has a lot of pockets. This knockoff of a BDU blouse has a lot of pockets that make it very easy to carry a lot of things. Toothbrush and toothpaste. Over here I've got my waterproof match container, my magnifying glass, my paper towel, just add water. In the upper pockets I can carry very important things like a compass, granola bar. Of course, it might be granola crumble by the time I get around to eating it. But just a jacket like this can carry a lot of good equipment, and you just put it on when you go into the field, and it becomes something that's very practical and easy to carry. Now, there's one more thing I want to add to everything I've said today. And I said this at the beginning, and I'm going to say it again now. Even though I've said a lot of things about you should do this and always make sure that you do that, remember, I am not trying to give you any advice. I'm not in any way trying to tell you what to do. This entire presentation was only explaining what I do and why. So, as always, don't try this at home on what you call a professional, and thanks for watching the Top 5 Tips for Wilderness Survival video.